Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So this is a talk that I prepared for SIST 2018 at Shifa University, and the Shifa Student Society was generous enough to invite me, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you all the talented students and SIST participants. And my name is Daniel Haqiqatjou. I originally planned to be there with you in person, but due to some last minute issues, I wasn't able to fly there. So I'm going to be talking to you from the US, in Texas, actually. So the other side of the globe. And I just want to give you some thoughts on this topic of freedom. And I know that I don't have much time, and I'm sure that you all are very tired, given that you've had a whole weekend of tournament and competition. So I just want to give you some brief thoughts on this concept of freedom and how we as Muslims should start thinking about and start understanding the concept of freedom within our own Muslim Islamic discourse. And so, just to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about in this short time, I just have two main points for you. Number one, freedom as a concept, freedom as it's practiced, is not all it's cracked up to be. Meaning, it hasn't been practiced and it hasn't played out in the way that we can see positive change and effect in the world. And this is apparent if we look at the different trends and we reflect on this particular moment in history today, as well as historically over time. What has this concept of freedom really achieved? And so this is something that I want to reflect on. And my conclusions are that it's not as glamorous and gilded as it may seem at first glance. The second point is that freedom as a concept is meaningless, vacuous, contentless, empty, and ultimately it's a radically subjective concept to the point of absolute irrelevance. Okay, so I'm going to try to prove these 2 points to you, and hopefully this will be a point of further discussion within your own circles, within your families, and I hope it'll be fruitful, inshallah. So let's get to the first point. So if we look at our current circumstance in the world and what freedom, the concept of freedom, has meant, it's not as beneficial as we might first think. Before we get to that, let me also define freedom for you. So I won't go into all the historical and the philosophical details of how this concept of freedom emerged, but just to define it, it emerged within the 17th, 18th century, 19th century British and French philosophy. You had philosophers like John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, Condorcet, Montesquieu, Voltaire. All of these British and French thinkers that you may have studied if you studied philosophy and history, they developed this idea of liberty and freedom. And it is a political ideal, it is a moral ideal. And what these philosophers claimed, is that the purpose of life is to be free. The purpose of life is to achieve freedom. And whatever will increase freedom, whatever will increase a person's freedom and liberty, that is good. And whatever decreases it or hinders it is morally bad. So they developed their moral philosophy based on this idea of freedom as a value to aspire to, because the purpose of life, the very purpose of life, according to these thinkers, is that humans have been born free and they need to attain this freedom. Okay, so whatever hinders that, whatever prevents human beings from achieving that or attaining that is bad. And in particular, they had religion in mind. Religion, and especially Islam, is a hindrance to human freedom because religion brings obligations and responsibilities, and this prevents people from attaining freedom. If you have a political system that's based on religion, then that also restricts freedom, it restricts liberty, it restricts people's human rights, and so on and so forth. So freedom is this political and moral value. So all this sounds great, right? It sounds very reasonable, makes sense. Who could argue with the value of freedom and the benefit of freedom? I mean, this is something that is very intuitive to the whole world, Muslims included. And you even see to such an extent that Muslim political movements and political parties throughout the Muslim world have adopted and tried to implement the language of freedom. Even within Pakistani politics, different parties will try to argue that their platform is most consistent with maximizing freedom and liberty and rights of human beings. All of this is related language that's coming from that tradition, that liberal tradition that first theorized the value of freedom as an aspirational goal. And so you have even Islamists using the language of freedom. The example that I like is Khomeini in Iran, in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. He was explicit about azadi being an aspiration. That's the purpose of the revolution. And azadi is, as you may know, the Farsi word for freedom. If you look at other Islamists, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they also, the official name of the party, of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, is the Freedom and Justice Party. Okay, so again, this idea of freedom is very powerful in political discourse in the Muslim world, even by Islamists. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of what freedom actually is, but does freedom live up to its promise? Okay, that's the question. Does freedom live up to its promise? And as I mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't seem so to me. Okay, and maybe you'll disagree, but I'll give you some examples. So let's look at the state of the free world, right? I was born and raised in the United States, the land of the free, right? These are the kinds of terms that are used to describe the Western world, the world of freedom. And look at the market, for example, the free market, as it's called, and the economic state of affairs that we find in the Western world. And what we find is that it's not actually a rosy picture at all. What we see is an ever-growing wealth gap, between the richest and the poorest. You have 1% of the world's population owning over half of the world's wealth. Okay, so major wealth inequality, major gap between the rich and the poor. Other statistics that are relevant here in the US, 83% of American adults have less than $1,000 in savings. Okay, less than $1,000 in savings. What does that mean? $1,000 is barely enough rent to pay for a basic apartment in most major cities in the United States. If you only have $1,000, okay, that won't cover even 1 month's rent, living expense. And 83% of Americans have less than that saved. Okay, so the amount of poverty is something that is growing, right? Poverty in the United States. is growing, and even around the world. And more statistics, if you look at the average American household, they are deeply and deeply in debt. The average American household is over $140,000 in debt. $140,000 in debt. Okay, and this is according to official statistics. And the median household income, how much money they're making annually, is less than $60,000. Okay, so more than double their income, they're in debt. And what is this debt? This is debt through because of school. This is debt because of getting college education, being able to buy a house, having a car. Everything is financed through debt. And so you see this extreme amount of debt that people are relying on loans to live their lives. And given, what we know about riba, and we know the negative spiritual and tangible consequences of life based on interest-bearing loans and riba, then we can see the state of the world. We can see the state of society. And this is something that the free market capitalism has only created, and has been a direct, this has been a direct result of that. So we see increased poverty. About 40% of Americans are in poverty. Another chunk is very close to the poverty line. So this is the state of today of the free market within the supposedly freest superpower of the world, United States. So let's look at the political sphere. Okay, another very relevant aspect of life and world politics within the United States. What has free democratic freedom, representative democracy, what has that resulted in? Well, look who's in office, who's sitting in the White House, right? The most incompetent person, the most corrupt person on every level, and we don't need to get into his intelligence or his personal life, but look at Donald Trump. And so you have a system that has resulted in such a person, like such a corrupt and rich, wealthy billionaire, okay, because he's worth billions, is sitting in the highest office of the land. So this is what democratic freedom has resulted in. And even before Trump, if you looked at the state of Washington, D.C. politics, the level of corruption, the level of corporate lobbying, the level of media control, and how the media allows business interests to control political decision making and how the public reacts within the United States to different issues, highlighting certain issues, ignoring certain issues of importance that impacts people's lives. This is all happening, and it is a very problematic, very destructive environment that's been created through these political systems that claim to be the most conducive to justice, the most conducive to freedom and equality, and all these values that we read about and we hear about within a lot of propaganda. We should also look at the impact to the environment, okay, of the free market, global capitalism, neoliberalism, economic policy. What has that done to the world environment? Okay, and I'm not going to belabor the point because we don't have much time, but look at the extreme weather, climate change that is causing a lot of damage and destruction around the world. In the US right now, the weather is record-breaking cold within the United States. And this past summer was record-breaking heat. This is causing a lot of suffering. And it's, again, due to this kind of unbridled free market capitalistic drive that has resulted in all of these kinds of problems. Another area of freedom is sexual freedom. Okay, the freedom to express yourself and to behave however you want according to your desires in a very hedonistic manner. This is something that was pioneered with the so-called sexual revolution in the 1960s in the United States and the Western world generally, and that kind of culture was disseminated across the world, initially through satellite TV, but now you have the internet, you have social media that is disseminating that kind of very permissive, promiscuous culture that is affecting so many people around the world. And so what has been the result of that? Well, there's been a hypersexualization of society, okay, hypersexualization, and that has caused all kinds of problems developmentally with children, with young adults, with adults. When you look at how that affects the mind, where you're constantly exposed, okay, to sexuality, and then also when it comes to behaviors. When you look at, again, the statistics in the United States, over half, actually not just the United States, all of Europe as well, if you look at the number of children that are born every year, over half are born to single mothers. Okay, over half of children are born to single mothers. And Islamically, we know that this is a disaster. This has extremely negative consequences, spiritually and ethically and so forth. But even from a purely secular basis, right, there are statistics that show that children that are born into single parent households, single mother households, are more likely to do drugs. They're more likely to fall into crime. They're more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to be unemployed. Okay, so all of these negative consequences societally, socially, come about because of this increase in the percentage of children that are born into single mother homes. So this is a big, even from a secular perspective, even if we don't even have to be religious to understand the impact of this for society and for each and every one of us. And then also recently in the news, look at what we see with sexual harassment. Okay, I don't know how much news you're following in Pakistan on this, but it's caused a huge scandal in the United States because of this idea of Me Too. Okay, Me Too. So many women coming out and saying, yes, I've been a victim of sexual harassment or sexual abuse. I've been taken advantage of. This is a disaster because it's caused so much confusion. Well, what is the appropriate way to behave with people of the opposite sex? And if you don't have religion, if you don't have moral principles, okay, timeless moral principles that go back to who we are as human beings, then it's anyone's guess. Okay, your opinion is just as good as someone else's opinion. And when you have a whole entire sexual revolution premised on this idea of anything goes, right? Anything is permitted. Okay, as long as it feels good or there's an understanding that you can express yourself, then that's fine. And this is the result. Now we have a crisis. Okay, not we, Muslims don't have a crisis so far as they have avoided the implications and the practices and behaviors that came with the sexual revolution, but society as a whole is in crisis. And as Muslims, we should care about that. Okay, we should care about that because we have to be concerned with our fellow human beings, right? Our brothers and sisters in humanity. We have to want to help. We have to be sympathetic, and we have solutions, right? We have solutions. Just something simple like avoiding khalwa, avoiding being alone, right, with the opposite gender. That's just one small piece of the pie, but it still can prevent so much of the kind of sexual harassment that people are reporting, okay, that are is being reported out of Hollywood and out of Washington, D.C. So this is the result. We've seen the result of sexual freedom and hypersexualization that has led to so much headache and so much crisis and pain and suffering as well. And then finally, let's look at freedom of identity. Okay, this idea that you're free to pursue whatever identity that you choose. And this is interesting because in the United States, recently, over the past 5 years, there has been a sudden surge of neo-Nazism. Okay, neo-Nazis are coming out of the woodwork. And when these neo-Nazis are interviewed, they say that, look, we have freedom of identity. If other ethnic groups can celebrate who they are, their identity as, Black identity, Native American identity, Asian identity. Well, we have our white identity. We have our white European heritage. Okay, why shouldn't we be able to celebrate that? Okay, why shouldn't we identify as European supremacists? Okay, so they're using the language of identity politics to justify their neo-Nazism. And you also have white supremacism, okay, hand in hand with that. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan as well. And they all are appealing to this identity politics to justify that, look, it's a free country. Okay, why should we be penalized for beliefs that we have, an identity that we want to express? So this is the kind of problems that are created when you claim that anything goes, that everything is free to be explored. And then even questioning of gender, okay? Transgenderism. This is something that we find a lot of within the United States as well, or increasing. There's a lot more media exposure to this issue, this idea that men who want to identify as women, or women who want to identify as men, okay, biologically they're one sex, but they feel that they do not identify with that sex. Okay, so this is again when you have subjectivized everything, and people are free to pursue anything, even when it comes to their own identity of who they are, regardless of biology, anatomy, regardless of social convention, regardless of tradition, regardless of religion, regardless of parental supervision, all of these things. If you throw that all out the window and you say, look, we need to pursue this kind of absolute freedom to rewrite the rules as we want, okay, it leads to chaos. It leads to so much confusion, okay, and we see that with the amount of confusion that is happening within the West currently. And I mean, a lot of people have called this a cultural crisis, okay? There's a cultural crisis happening within the Western world where this idea of liberty and freedom is now in question, okay? And there are books that are being written and published that say, the end of liberty, the end of freedom, okay? These ideas that we had and we thought would lead to progress and would lead to utopia and the salvation of humanity on this earth, it didn't pan out. It didn't pan out the way that we wanted, okay? And so it's ironic to me that Muslims are trying to use or trying to claim freedom for themselves when the rest, of the so-called advanced civilized world has decided that actually this wasn't so great. This is something that we need to get rid of. It actually has caused a lot of harm. and Muslims are, catching up or behind in that. So I find that ironic. And I mean, we don't even have to go into the history of, Western colonialism. So much destruction has been wrought in the name of freedom. Look at the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, the continuing global war on terror, okay, which is predicated on the spread of freedom and democracy, right? It justifies that in the discourse within the West, okay? So we don't even need to go into the details of that to see how destructive this very seemingly simple concept has been for humanity in the past 200, 300 years. Okay, hopefully I've given you some ideas about why this idea of freedom is not all it's cut out to be. But now I also want to talk about why the very concept of freedom is meaningless. Okay? Because what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be free? Does it mean you can just do whatever you want? Okay, let's be critical, okay, and think and take a concept and break it down and analyze it and see what it actually means. We shouldn't just be using words without analyzing it further logically. So what does it mean to be free? Does it mean to do whatever you want to do? Okay? And okay, well, that's a good place to start, but then if being free means being able to do whatever you want to do, how do you know that what you want to do is something that is actually good for you? How do you know that the things that you want to do, that you desire to do, will actually benefit you? Okay, what is there to guarantee that that's the case? And when you realize, and this is understood Islamically, okay, that your desires, right, can be a source of destruction. Okay, you can desire things that are bad for you. They might appear to you, and Allah says this in the Quran, that something might seem good to you, but in fact it's evil, and something might seem evil to you, but it's actually beneficial for you. Okay, so this is it's a crucial part of Islamic ontology, right, and epistemology. But even beyond that, we know in the social sciences that human beings are influenced, okay, by socialization. Human beings are influenced by media, okay. Human beings are influenced by news and their education, their family, their culture. These are all things that impact how you perceive the world and how you interact with the world, and also what you desire and what you want for yourself and for others. Okay, so how can you know that what you want to do, because different people have different wants, different people have different desires. How can you know that those desires and those wants are actually good for you, or actually will benefit you? Okay, and it's very easy to see how people can be influenced negatively to desire things that ultimately are not good for them. Just look at something very simple, the idea of fashion. Okay, fashion. People will spend so much time and will spend so much money on cosmetics and their hair and their clothes, getting tattoos, all of these things that cost a lot of money, cost a lot of time, cost even pain and suffering. Okay, some cosmetic surgery is not something insignificant. You're literally cutting yourself open to change yourself, right? But this is what people desire. This is what many people desire, especially different parts of the world and the country. Look at how much time people spend on their hobbies. Okay, and not all of these hobbies are beneficial. Look at people who desire to do drugs, okay, and do abuse different substances. These are desires that they have, but it's causing them harm. Okay, so would we consider that a freedom? Okay, And so that's the question. How do we know that what we want and what we desire is actually good for us and is beneficial for us? And so the way that we would define freedom, okay, is that you first have to identify what are the things that are good for human beings, right? What are the things that are beneficial to a human being, okay? And that's something that different people will disagree on, right? If you're coming from a secular tradition, if you're coming from the Islamic tradition, okay, we hold certain truths about what a human being is, okay, how we've been created, what is beneficial for an individual, what can bring the most benefit and allow a human being to flourish in this life and the next. Okay, other people have different opinions, okay, and we can critique that and we can have a debate on that. But then freedom just depends on what you think is actually beneficial to a human being. So that means it is, as far as a secular perspective is concerned, it's very context dependent. Okay, what might be considered a restriction and a burden within one context is actually freeing within another. Okay, and I could give you examples of this, but I think I'm out of time. So, I just want to emphasize, if you take nothing else from what I said in this session, is I just had two main points. Freedom is not what it's cut out to be when we look at our surroundings, when we look at the world around us and its history. And then also the very concept is meaningless, is vacuous. And I, invite you to ask these kinds of questions, to be more critical, to think about these topics more deeply. And I'm, mashallah, a lot of bright minds over there. And I'm sure that the next generation of brilliant thinkers, Muslim thinkers, will come out of Pakistan, inshallah, and we have high expectations. And I'm looking forward to the future and your contributions, inshallah. Again, jazakumullah khair for inviting me. It was a pleasure and an honor to speak to you, and I hope you have a great rest of your tournament. Assalamu alaikum.